So what I'd like to do now is introduce our guest speaker for tonight. As Sutherland Group members know, Ralph Cartwright does a fantastic job organising fantastic speakers for us every month. And I'm very pleased to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Professor Dieter Hocchuli. He's from the University of Sydney at the School of Life and Environmental Sciences. And he's actually supervised some of the students that have spoken to us in the past about their research projects on various aspects of animals and ecology. So it's great to have Dieter with us tonight, and to be talking about the importance of insects in remnant bushland. Dieter will be sharing his screen during his presentation, and Ralph will be muting everyone else. And as Ralph mentioned, you can type a question to Dieter in the chat box, and I understand Dieter will be breaking the presentation up into several parts so we can ask questions about each part. So I'll now ask Dieter to share his screen, and Ralph will mute everyone else. So thanks very much, Dieter.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me at the Australian Plant Society talk. I'm seeing a few of my ex-students in the room, and they'll know I'm a real imposter when it comes to plants, so hopefully I'll be able to get away with speaking about some of these things. Look, tonight I'd really like to speak a bit about the importance of insects broadly in urban ecosystems and remnant bush in particular, but really give some thoughts on the global insect crisis too. As Ralph and Rhonda mentioned, I've tried to break this into a couple of parts just to try and break it up a little bit. I think a lot of us are probably a bit sick of staring at screens for a while, but I'd like to speak a bit about the global insect crisis quite broadly. Maybe not the most uplifting image I've got there to support it. I'll talk a bit in the second part about the ecology of cities and some new work that we've just brought out that talks about how insects respond to what are hostile environments in cities, and also how we can plant to try and promote them. And I'll speak about some really new stuff that I'm quite excited about that I think aligns really nicely with the goals of your society. And ultimately, I'm going to push for some, probably reclaiming a bit of the naturalist tradition and trying to share our stories a little bit better. That's where I'm hoping to go with this today. And I wanted to break it up because I think, like many of us, it's, our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter the longer we're at home. Please don't hesitate if you can't hear me or if the sound's not coming through. I've got other options here to fiddle if things aren't working. So please don't hesitate to lob something in the chat for that. My background is basically this. I've been at the University of Sydney for 25 years, ostensibly staring at the same insect in publicity photographs. I'm an entomologist at heart. My interests are insects and spiders. I've recently moved into other groups as well. I'll try and move forwards this time. We've started working on birds in various ways. I'll actually allude to our brush turkey work a little bit later too, because that's getting quite exciting. In terms of feeling like an imposter, I think one of the greatest moments of frustration for the birding community as I've come to these things late in life was when one of Sydney's tabloid shock jocks decided to label me a bird expert. It's upset my colleagues at BirdLife Australia no end. But I've made sure I've got multiple copies of this particular image because it's amusing for my benefit. Here's what I wanted to start with. You've probably heard a lot of the stories relating to a series of insect crises. Some of the things that we speak about relate to things like insect Armageddons or bee crises. These are some of the sorts of stories that have been popularised, particularly in the last 5 years or so. This is a screen capture from the ABC News site on the left there that describes a foreign correspondent story that related to an alarming decline in insects in Europe. Now, it's probably fair to say that that's an important piece of work. That's based on some published research that came out that was based on some long-term observations of flying insects in Germany and looking at a significant ongoing and quite predictable decline in biomass in a range of protected areas throughout Germany. So there was a basis to a lot of this work that was really substantive. There are also significant concerns over the decline in honeybees, particularly in North America and in parts of Europe through both neonicotinoid pesticides and Varroa destructor, the mite that attacks their hives. So there's some really significant issues. It leads to stories like this one in the New York Times. There's no mincing of words here with the insect apocalypse is here. What does this mean for the rest of life on Earth? You're probably familiar with the selling point for insects can sometimes be, even if you don't like them, they're critical for life on Earth and we need to keep them. So there's a narrative emerging here. It's emerged in the scientific literature as well. There's some colleagues from our agriculture department at the University of Sydney, Paco Sanchez-Boyer and Chris Wickoys, wrote a review on the worldwide decline of the entomofauna. This is one of the things that really garnered an enormous amount of publicity. And so far you might be thinking, well, that's handy if you're a scientist. It gives you some issues that you can start to say there's going to be an impact on this sort of work. It's important to us. It's quite convenient if you're an entomologist trying to make your work more relevant. But what's really important here isn't the work about the concerns over declines. It's the backlash that came out. What I wanted to start with was really talk about some of the work that came out that actually said, hang on, I think you guys are being a little bit alarmist about talking about global declines. These are some titles of some papers that came out in response to the global declines drivers. They've come out in a range of quite significant journals and peer-reviewed work, trying to use a range of other approaches to assessing the evidence to see just how significant the declines were. Papers with titles like A Call for More Robust Data and Rigorous Analyses. Another one saying alarms by bad designs, unsubstantiated claims undermine the credibility of conservation science. Other people saying we need to interpret with caution. Now, if you're familiar with how academics work, it's probably in our best interest to have a crisis or an alarm. What's really important here is there was a school of thought, and a really robust school of thought, that said, if this data are being analysed inappropriately, we're causing problems for ourselves. And this is something that's really emphasised in this particular paper and some of the wording that's used. I've just pasted a few bits of the abstract through here, but there's some phrasing here that really isn't consistent with what you might expect to see in a scientific paper. It talks about the biased methods and flawed analyses used by Sanchez-Boyer and Wickoys lead to unsupported conclusions on the extinction of vast numbers of insect species in the near future. The results of Sanchez-Boyer and Wickoys received short-term attention in the global media, but we believe this might undermine the credibility of insect conservation efforts, environmental sciences in general, and even the peer review process. Now, that's not mincing words. That's not language that you would typically see in a scientific journal. And it's a consistent set of themes that's come out with respect to some of this. So the point I wanted to make first was simply that there are a range of valid concerns relating to the conservation of insects and elevated rates of extinctions for insects. But it's really critical that as a discipline, we actually take up a stand against things that we think might be mediocre science. And this is a really interesting backlash. There's a far more nuanced conversation going on at the moment with respects to global insect declines. But I think it's important to realise that the stuff you might have seen popularised in a range of media has probably caused a bit of a backlash in the entomological community. First little point. Now, I just wanted to point too that I'm not saying that there's not a problem with extinctions. You're probably familiar with mammals in particular, but Australia are the world leaders in causing the extinctions of their native animals. If you look at the extinctions since 1500 on the left-hand side through here, there's been an extraordinary rate of extinctions, particularly in the last 100 years or so. And even in the last 40 years or so, the declines in survival since 1980 show quite a few issues with respects to quite a range of groups. So the simple point I want to say is there's still a problem with respects to extinctions, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the insect perspective in a sec, but it's important to realise that the statements of catastrophic insect declines have been deemed as problematic. I mentioned that sometimes it's in our self-interest as researchers to popularise these things. This is probably another thing that annoys some of us in Australia with respects to the popularisation of this. Is a shot from the Insect Rebellion bee emergency protest in Sydney. What wasn't frustrating is that they'd chosen insects as their iconic species, but they hadn't actually delved into the really good ones that we've got. Now, the point I wanted to make here is simply we have an extraordinary array of insects and native bees in particular in Sydney. One of the things that we're really keen to do is actually start promoting these guys, not the European honeybees that you may have seen. in my previous image through there, and just realise that we've got great opportunities to actually start promoting these things. I'll speak a little bit about how native plantings can sometimes promote the diversity of these animals in remnant systems, but also just realise that there's a whole suite of things that we probably don't promote as well as we ought to. This is a beautiful poster that you can actually buy off Etsy from Gina Cranston Artworks, and I believe the Botanic Gardens had a whole bunch of their plants with by exhibition recently too. So I've just got to move back to my other screen, I just realised, which is here. Right. So one of the things I've talked about there is just some notions, I'm just keeping an eye on the time here, of threatened species and extinctions. I just wanted to also point out that threatened species legislation and management, as we've got it in most of the world, but in Australia in particular, is a tool that's not fit for the job we want it to do, similar to this pump and this tyre through here. There are problems with insects that we struggle to resolve. This is recently released reports from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment in Sydney. The Biodiversity Outlook, it talks about notions of, as you might be able to see here, that 50% of our listed species are likely to go extinct within 100 years. 73% of our plant species are likely to survive, and so on. I wanted to point this one out here in terms of a tool not being fit for purpose. This is a list of the threatened species from different groups combined expected to survive in 100 years. So it's looking at the survival and the loss. Green means you survived. Grey means you'll probably die within 100 years, and really dark grey means that you're going to lose. The problem is here. This number is tiny. It's tiny for a range of reasons. I didn't do any particularly clever modelling, but I did draw where this bar maybe ought to be in some cases. One of the points I wanted to make here is that the tool of using listed species and known species is problematic because we simply don't know enough about most of the fauna here. This is again, I should have done my homework on the plant community here. I don't want to badmouth plants in front of this audience. This is a discovery curve showing how many new plant species have been discovered, and just basically shows that as we keep looking, the numbers of new species we find is declining because we're getting a good idea of how many we've got within New South Wales. One of the reasons we don't know and can't list many of the insects in these areas at the moment, such as these hoverflies, which I'll allude to a little bit later, is we simply don't know most things about most of these animals. So the problems we've got are here. There might be an extinction crisis for insects. It's not supported by some of the evidence that's there. Part of the reason we're concerned is that we know so little about so much. So in terms of a first break to start with in this case, one of the problems I feel that we've got is that we can complain about this as entomologists as much as we like, but finding the solutions is particularly difficult. So in terms of what I was hoping to do then, I'll get back to sharing the second part, but I think there's some key things to take out of that point here. I saw Rhonda's question through here, and I'll just address that quickly now, about would the possible use of insects as a human food source lead to greater interest in insect numbers and research? It's certainly a really big part of our thinking at the moment with respect to popularising insects. There's a whole lot of good reasons that you might want to grow insect protein rather than other types of protein. Supermarkets are now stocking insect flowers. I'm probably not a big adopter of them. I've had a lot of people will feed you insect cupcakes and insect chocolate cakes, and I'm probably a bigger fan of the more traditional ones. I think the insect flavour still shines through at the moment. I think it's a really important thing from a sustainability perspective, but your question, Rhonda, about affecting people's interests is really significant, because we look at engagement with different groups, and Ryan Keith, who's one of my students who I know spoke to you, I think last year, this studies Nature Connections with Children has recently got some great data that just shows that we can speak about bugs, plants, anything to kids up until about 11 or 12, and then something goes horribly wrong. The silver bullet, we think, would be to try and find ways to engage with people in their 13 to 30 age groups, to really find a way to foster that love of nature and that connection with nature with those groups. But so eating them will probably help a little bit, but the conservation perspective really relies on us really doing the basic work and either reframing how we do our conservation, moving away from a species-focused approach, or trying to invest heavily in learning what the species we've got are. Okay, so I just wanted to give people a bit of a break from staring at PowerPoint. Does anyone have any comments or questions they'd like to raise? And I'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for that too, if people would like. But I'd also like to talk to you now about some of the recent stuff we know about remnant things. So I might ball in the chat. I can't see anything in there. Great, so I will go back to the cranky dudes from the Muppets and sort of Act 2. What I wanted to speak a little bit about was about nature persisting and thriving in cities and how we can basically engage with invertebrates and engage with insects and study them to the point that we're going to get some new insights, not only into how these kinds of systems work. Now, this system here this is one of the wetlands and some of the replanted bushlands at the old Sydney tip at St. Peter's, which is now Sydney Park. But realise that we can actually start getting some benefits to, I suppose, relatively small plantings like these ones through here. So what I'm hoping to do is go through and talk to you a bit about the ecology of animals or invertebrates in particular in isolated areas and delve into the things that we think can help promote them in these areas with respects to the land management actions we can take. Now, I think it's pretty clear that when we think of cities and we think of remnants and we think of isolated chunks of bushland in cities, we tend to realise that the things that tend to persist tend to be the hangers-on or the opportunists. There's some great work that shows there's a whole bunch of animals that actually are adapting reasonably well to some elements of cities. The brushtails obviously are dealing quite well with the influx of food that they're getting. The blue triangle butterfly on the bottom left corner here has really warmed to camphor laurels. It's decided that its natural native host plant is okay, but the camphor laurels are fantastic. So there's some nice work that shows that these butterflies have decided that they'll move onto some plants that haven't got a lot of traction. I think Lizzie Lowe, one of my students, may have spoken to you about her golden orb weavers in the past, about how some of these spiders really do thrive once they've got the complexity that they need just to build their webs. And I was lucky enough to work on powerful owls for a project recently, and I'm quite enamoured of these birds and their capacity to, in the case of this one, live in the Botanic Gardens, fly from there to Centennial Park, to Bondi, to Watson's Bay and back, and basically pick off all sorts of unsuspecting mammals in many of these places. So there's a lot of animals that do thrive in these areas. The inverts are likely to be the same. So I just wanted to acknowledge in this case the fact that I'm really lucky to have a whole suite of people who don't necessarily like to be called minions, but I've got a great lab and a great group of students and postdoctoral fellows who are really smart, hardworking and motivated people that have been in a position to really do some work that captures a lot of their interests. And that means that I've been able to collaborate with them and work on a whole range of animals and plants and even people that I wouldn't have worked with otherwise. Things like rats, ticks, bats, birds and things like that. So I'm really fortunate to be able to pick and choose some of the systems I get to work in and some of the things we get to do. So I'm going to go through a few examples and just give you some short bits of work that we do. Now, the take-home messages is that we've got the overarching thing that captures our work at the moment is we're interested in how nature persists in cities and how it thrives in cities and how things of high conservation significance can persist. One of the things we do know is that some simple measures of habitat, such as green tree cover, canopy cover and ground layers, can help identify high quality habitat. But the points we start with is that, you know, cities are hostile. A lot of things don't persist, but some things do. We're interested in the selection pressures that are imposed by cities on plants and animals, the pressures of everything from water to nutrients to pollution and how that influences their persistence. And also just try and work out how, I guess a lot of the things that we work on don't seem to realise they're living in one of Australia's largest cities. So I'm going to go through just very briefly a couple of recent case studies of work that we've just processed and analysed. So the first piece of work comes from Manuel Lecarica, who spoke, I think, to this group too. We've just finished a larger body of work here. He's also learnt, if you look at that photo on the right, not to let me choose the photos we use for these kinds of talks, but we essentially wanted to look at whether intact forest areas support different fauna to remnant areas compared to basic parklands. So one of the predictions we would have is that the areas here in these parklands close to the city, often highly modified environments, support different insects to the ones in remnant vegetation, which are often isolated, quite depauperate in their flora, compared to some of these relatively larger intact forests. We've got broader definitions of what we use there in terms with respect to remnant and intact forests, but essentially we are based on size traits. And the next slide I'm going to show is a little bit detailed, but it really captures some critical drivers of what we think are important to maintain in cities to promote insect diversity. Now, speaking of insect diversity is a bit of an odd thing. It's a bit like speaking about plant diversity. There are so many different types of plants doing so many different types of things. There's not going to be a silver bullet, or there shouldn't be a silver bullet to predict what's going to be good for plants and what's going to be poor for plants. This has come out in our data for 4 different groups of insects as well here. If you just bear with me with this slide here, we've got in this here beetles, flies, bugs, hemipterans, and hymenopterans, bees and wasps. What we wanted to do is see which landscape traits could be used to predict areas of greater diversity. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do here is basically test to see whether there's a suite of things together that would enhance diversity. They're the questions we're often being asked by land managers. What do we need to plant? How much do we need to plant? And will that bring back our things? And we go, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It turns out that it was a little bit more complicated than that, but there was one thing that really leapt out in terms of supporting diversity in relatively small environments. And that's these graphs with the yellow bars through here. So for all 4 of our key groups here, particularly for the remnants that supported higher diversity, we found that diversity of plants promoted the diversity of the inverts. And this is something that's important because it's something that's often assumed, but there's very little data to actually support that particular assumption. The other part of it was that we couldn't look at plant species richness alone. Each of the models we developed had another part of it, the diversity being explained by another component. And this is where things tended to differ quite significantly. Now, I should also flag that the fly we chose here is a particularly ugly fly. The flies we tended to work on here were hoverflies, really important pollinators, whoops. And so what's happened here is that green space proportion within 2 kilometres was a driver for our beetles. Green space within 1 kilometre was a driver for our flies, a negative driver. Proportions of native flowers with plants were a big driver of our bug diversity, with the bugs often feeding on those flowers. And proportion within these green space proportion within a single kilometre was important here. So what happened here is there was one particular driver, that was plant species richness, and it operated in concert with other things. The second factors for the different groups were very, very different. So the take home here is that plant species richness was vital, but we needed to look at the diversity of other factors that could affect things. We're now looking at structural attributes to see how that might influence things as well. Not an Australian plant, lantana, obviously not so good. And I'm going to say something now, which for anyone that's been outside and stared at weeds of any sort, which will be fairly self-evident. Every bush regen person we show this to tells us we've been the masters of stating the obvious. Georgie Barron, this is part of an honours project a few years ago, simply trying to categorise the small insectivorous birds that were using lantana as habitat in the North Shore. What was really nice about this work wasn't so much the stating the obvious part, which is this next bit, which is basically that if you maintained and kept lantana in your remnants, you are far more likely to have those communities of small insectivorous birds than when they weren't there. There are some stats here, but you can see here, see here, the blue bar shows the small birds weren't there. The red bar shows that they were there. What was interesting with this, that's sort of self-evident, but what was really fascinating about this was the next part of this work that we did, which was using sentinel caterpillars to try and basically test whether the chance of a caterpillar being attacked or the services provided by these small insectivorous birds were supported by the lantana. One of the neatest results we had, so we basically get these caterpillars, these plasticine caterpillars, we roll them out, put them on a piece of wire, leave them out for 3 to 7 days, and we look at the markings on them to see how many have been attacked and who's attacked them. And it gives us an insight into the background rates of predation. And one of the interesting things is that the lantana was actually supporting a group of birds and insects that were providing this ecosystem service of regulating insect numbers in these remnants. What was interesting here is that even though the birds were present, most of our attacks were being caused by invertebrates in areas of lantana. A really interesting story with respects to that. So this is one of those nice things that shows us. Now, I might just go back to Rhonda's question here, by the way, just looking at, she's asked, does plant species richness include the full range of ground covers, shrubs and trees? This was basically shrubs and trees. We left ground cover out of this particular study. So the evidence we've got here, and I'll just move back to, go back the other way to Manuel's data. The evidence in here for plant species richness related to shrubs and trees in this instance. We didn't do the ground cover in that case. I didn't go through the detail because I'm probably going for the big picture here. So I hope that answers your question. I'm really happy to deal with that after again. But our next thing was really kind of fun. This is sort of getting away from the terrestrial plants we work on. This was an opportunity to look at urban wetlands and this desire to recreate wetlands and urban ecosystems by creating the wetlands, planting them with native vegetation, and trying to look at just what the benefits of these particular wetlands were going to be. So the biodiversity benefits, the aesthetic benefits, and the stormwater management benefits are really clear. The flip side that comes with them is obviously these guys, mosquitoes. So one of the things that we're often asked to do is to talk about the things that might enhance diversity in places. And I'm just going to have a look at things that aren't so much plant related, but I think it's a great story because one of the concerns we've got is, can we manage urban wetlands for diversity and the public health risks that come from mosquitoes? So Jane Hanford, who's recently finished her PhD, did this work which involved her wading through wetlands, collecting the aquatic bugs, looking at setting up CO2 traps for mosquitoes. She worked as far down as Wollongong through to Western Sydney. And she came up with a series of results that tried to look at the conflicts between managing for biodiversity and managing public health risks. So there's a lot of community concern about mosquitoes in urban wetlands. Arboviruses are something that we're always increasingly getting worried about. The impacts of climate change and the predicted influx of different types of mosquitoes make this a particularly important thing for us to consider. A lot of the mosquitoes we deal with tend to be nuisances rather than public health risks specifically, owing to the viruses that they cause, but they're still things that capture public imagination. Summarising 5 years of work of Jane is basically she found that wetland quality and surrounding land use affect mosquito risk. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all thing for all mosquitoes. Different species of mosquito responded differently. And this is one of the challenges we face when you're working on mosquitoes. You know, when you speak about insects broadly, we love to talk about our butterflies and our native bees. A lot of people find it hard to market mosquitoes to people. I certainly do. But what's important is there's so many different species in Australia. Overwhelmingly, most of them don't influence us. We need to understand the ones that do have the public health consequences. The beauty of Jane's work was that we found really strong patterns that showed that there wasn't evidence of a conflict between managing for biodiversity conservation in wetlands and managing for mosquito risks. Now, these papers both came out last year. I'm more than happy to make anything available to you. While I've got you all trapped at the end of Zoom, just something to realise, if you ever would like access to any of our papers, please don't hesitate to email us or contact us. Many of the papers we publish are still published behind paywalls for journals. We have a passion for sharing our research, and we're more than happy to share it with you whenever it's at all possible. So please, if things might interest you, don't hesitate to contact us and let us know. But these two papers that Jane put together really were a nice combo of the public health risks and the biodiversity conservations together. So the final example I wanted to speak about isn't the remnant example so much, but it's one that's really captured imagination lately. We know that air pollution is one of the massive killers on the planet. It's something that we're particularly concerned about with respects to humans. We all noticed a significant decline in air pollution with our isolation and shutdowns owing to the COVID-19 crisis at the moment. I wanted to talk about some work from Ryan Leonard, who's just returned from the University of Illinois after a couple of year postdoc, who was studying the impacts of pollution on a range of pollinators. And this is a story I really like to share because it mimics exactly what's happening with people. Ryan's work involved exposing honeybees to air pollution and testing how it affected their learning of floral smells and other cues, and how it led to them remembering them and keeping them. So learning and remembering them. So this is essentially what Ryan did here. This is a group of honeybees being trained. They're restrained in these containers through here. They're exposed to a suite of odours. We used 3 volatiles off the shelf, isolated volatiles that are essentially flower smells that bees use to help find resources, as well as whole geraniums that gave the whole shebang of the whole cocktail of signals to a bee. We trained them in the presence of pollution and the absence of pollution, and we measured their responses. They basically will stick out their proboscis in response to a stimulus. And what we found essentially was this, and I'll just go through it very quickly, was that bees take longer to learn polluted smells and they forget them quicker. It's a really fascinating story about some of the pressures of urban life. And sometimes even if we find species living in particular areas, these things could be particularly problematic. So this has been the big part of the talk in terms of me trying to get through and talk about